put you guys down. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Welcome to Committee of the Whole for March 13th, 2023. We have one item on the agenda, and it is our inclusion and equity update. I'm going to turn it over to Mary J. Van Cleve.
Council President, council members, as stated before, we said we would return, and so it is my honor to introduce Benita Horn, our gracious consultant, and walk us through some recommendations. We've been working really hard to capture the work, the legacy, the support, all the conversations that have culminated over the last 9 years. We've done a lot of effort to memorialize that so that we can really build upon the work that has been done and the conversations, as well as unfinished items that we know council would like to see us accomplish and work towards. With that said, Benita's going to go over recommendations, and I'll be here to kind of chime in on operationalized opportunities and maybe things that may be happening as well. Thank you.
Thank you, MJ. So I see us at this juncture at a pivotal point in our journey toward our goal of inclusion. And it really is a journey of transforming the culture of the city. And my work, as you know, is focused on the business plan goal of inclusion. And I see inclusion not as the equal distribution of social and racial and economic inequities, but I see inclusion occurring when social, economic, and racial inequities are no longer a predictive factor in whether or not someone overcomes barriers and accesses opportunities. So tonight, we're following up, as MJ said, from our last meeting with you on December 5th, and bringing some recommendations to you. We're going to start with a little bit of background, go through the recommendations, our rationale for those particular recommendations, and who we see as the potential leads to carrying that recommendation to the next level, and then just an open discussion. But as always, at any time, if any of you have questions, please just feel free to ask them. So with that, a little bit of background. As you know, I've been with you since May of 2014. This was a one-year contract to see if there really was a rationale for having someone with the responsibilities that fell on me, and my charge was to provide consulting services to move the goal of inclusion, to move the needle of the goal of inclusion in the following ways: by supporting systemic changes, approaches within the city for achieving equitable outcomes in policies, programs, and procedures, providing and or arranging for training for staff to provide them with tools and resources for incorporating inclusion and equity into their day-to-day work. Envisioning and implementing endeavors, activities, and events that engaged community members in partnership with the city and gave them a voice, providing technical assistance and support to the mayor, to all of you, staff, boards and commissions, community partners, and residents in support of equitable outcomes. And my final annual contract completes the end of this month. And so this presentation provides high-level recommendations for building on the work that has been done to continue forward movement on the goal of inclusion. And I asked you all to share with me your vision for inclusion in the city of Renton when we met in December. And I have to say how affirming it was to me that what I heard from you really aligned with what our thinking has been about where we go from here. So you will also see your thoughts reflected in these recommendations. So the first recommendation is to continue external and internal inclusion assessments to track progress on the goal of inclusion and to aid in affirming progress on this goal. I would recommend that we use existing data from recent related assessments like the one that the communications team did, some of the work that human services has done and so forth, to minimize duplication, to minimize survey fatigue on the part of our stakeholders. But I also see it an essential piece that we've not yet had, which is to survey staff. And the rationale behind that is in 2014, when I first started working with you all, I conducted a high-level assessment that included everyone on council at that time, the mayor, administrators and their direct reports, community partners, and residents, but staff was not included. And I think it's time as we move forward to hear the voice of staff. I would see the lead in that as the Equity, Housing, and Human Services, as well as Executive Services Department. I'm going to keep moving unless you have questions at any point. The second recommendation is to continue to ensure administrators and all of you have the knowledge and skills that you desire to champion and lead equity and inclusion in the city. In 2014, the administrators in place at that time actually worked with me to co-design, and they also co-facilitated for their staff all of the inclusion workshops. And that was their idea as a way to deepen their own skills and knowledge. All council members attended that workshop, and where we sit today as a result of turnover, very few of the initial administrators and council members are still in place. And so that may be a miss. And I would see the lead for that as human resources and equity, housing, and human services. The third recommendation is to continue to establish and expand on quantitative and qualitative metrics to track and regularly report progress on equity and inclusion. I think we're at that point in time where we really need to begin doing that effectively. In 2014, one of the things that came up from that initial assessment was that, administrators felt that they were making some progress on the goal of inclusion, but felt a gap existed in consistently and uniformly gathering and reporting meaningful outcomes. So as a result, this has been part of my ongoing work, meetings and conversations with staff and research that has created the foundation for moving forward on this recommendation. You also have in our Equity, Housing, and Human Services team, both MJ's leadership and Chan's expertise in creating metrics for other city jurisdictions. So we have some talent on board that can really help us move forward on this. The fourth recommendation is to continue to use and expand use of the Renton equity lens to support authentic community engagement and equitable outcomes in our planning, in our projects, in our policy development, and in policy updates. As you know, the Renton Equity Lens was created in 2016. It was first used in 2017 to conduct an analysis on outreach and hiring practices and processes. And that led to the HR inclusion and tactical plan, which made great changes in some of the systems in hiring. Then from 2020 to 2021, staff were provided with overviews of the Renton Equity Lens. And then last October, we brought in an expert who not only is certified in project management, but also as an equity consultant. And that person spent a full day. Actually, we devoted and expanded our quarterly managers session in October to not only include those who regularly attend, but also project teams and project leads. And he spent a full day helping them to see how to use the Renton Equity Lens in planning and project management. So a deep dive, and there will be some ongoing work with that consultant. So at this point, staff are now equipped and can be accountable for using the Renton equity lens. And I see the lead on this as the administrators, the executive leadership team, and Equity Housing and Human Services. And then recommendation, and I made this 4A instead of recommendation 5 because this one rests on the previous recommendation that administrators, council, and council committees can consistently ask questions supporting the use of the Renton equity lens, leading to equitable outcomes on recommendations presented to you. So accountability, as you know, becomes the norm when leadership coaches for success. And all of you, as well as the administrators, are in that position in the city. So suggested questions that you could ask: how and when was the Renton equity lens applied to this recommendation? How were stakeholders identified, and at what point were stakeholders engaged in the process, and how? What were the outcomes of the Renton equity lens analysis, and what strategies were put in place to mitigate unintended consequences? Depending on the recommendation before you, you all would be in the best position to determine what questions would be appropriate at that point in time. But just asking those questions certainly sends a message about the expectation of using the Renton equity lens. The fifth recommendation, to standardize and schedule essential inclusion workshops annually to keep up with turnover in staff, boards and commissions, and council. Some of those workshops would be the Inclusion Foundation Workshop, the Renton Equity Lens Overview, the Language Line Workshop, and so forth. In recent years, staff turnover has been high. From November to January, I facilitated workshops for 120 new hires last year. And so to keep pace, I think it's time that we have regular versus on-call training that's established on a city annual training calendar, or perhaps added to the curriculum for the onboarding for new employees, new employee orientation, because that is already scheduled 3 times a year. And I would see the lead on that being human resources and risk management, equity, housing, and human services, and executive services. The sixth recommendation is to continue making inclusive contracting a priority. Track and quantify results on contracting with minority, women-owned, and disadvantaged small businesses. Act with urgency to provide equitable access and remove barriers to purchasing and contracting for these vendors. And the rationale is that in 2017, finance, actually was ASD at that time, began taking steps toward the goal of improving access to city purchasing and contracting. And one of their biggest barriers was at that point in time, they had no way even to track who our MWBE and DBE vendors were. And so that was the first big hurdle that they addressed. And a lot of steps have been taken since that time. In 2021, they held their first workshop called Navigating City Contracting for minority women and women-owned businesses and disadvantaged small business contractors. And there was a great turnout for that. The progress and in the debrief, the planning team agreed that this would be good to have these workshops on an ongoing basis, at least 1 or more times a year, because it's not only about educating vendors on how to do business with the city, but at the same time building relationships with these vendors so they feel more comfortable and confident in applying for work with the city. Progress was paused on this work because of the biennial budget process, so it's time to pick that up again. And I would see the lead on this as finance, executive services, and equity, housing, and human services. The seventh recommendation is to explore the efficacy of operating agreements for city work groups, boards, and commissions, resulting in shared expectations of behavior and a foundation for collective and individual feedback and growth. The rationale, two commissions already have such operating agreements, one for several years and one quite recently, as a way to diffuse what had become a critical burning point in their commission. The impact has been clarity on providing feedback and on assessing productive behavior in these groups. And in the research that was conducted, this has been across the board one of the most pivotal, one of the most founding pieces for people really feeling comfortable and confident in giving each other feedback. I would see the lead on this as executive services and EHHS. And those two departments, by the way, have already developed a proposal for this process. The eighth recommendation is to conduct research on a process for uniformly compensating certain community members for time spent on boards and commissions or providing input for various city engagement efforts. The rationale, an increasing number of jurisdictions have already implemented such a process that affirms the value of resident time spent contributing to city planning and projects. Renton currently does this for most community engagement activities by simply including money in the contract for the consultant to provide for stipends for residents who participate. So it's not without precedent in our city. I would see the lead on this as executive services and finance. The ninth recommendation is to continue to use the Renton business plan to set priorities for council and staff to align work throughout the city. I can't tell you how delighted I was when I got this postcard in the mail from all of you with your beautiful faces on there and the business plan goals listed as your 2023 priorities. And, you know, I work with a lot of jurisdictions, and it's rare that the mayor and the entire council could send out a document like this to all of the residents in the city and really mean it. So, you know, just my chest puffed out when I got that in the mail. The rationale for this recommendation is that the Renton business plan goals set the overarching priorities for the city and determines the allocation of resources. And so to continue to use the business plan as a guide for the day-to-day work of each staff member in the city would result in everyone seeing what their piece of the action was and what their contribution was toward meeting those goals. And so I see the lead on this as executive services, EHHS, and also in alignment with the work that Human Services and Risk Management has already done in making sure that the staff performance evaluation process is inclusive of the business plan goals. And recommendation 10, the final recommendation, is to continue to support and expand relationships with the various groups of Renton residents to further community engagement and to encourage the voice of community in city government. You know, when I came on in 2014, we didn't have a lot of community groups. As a matter of fact, the city helped launch some. There was the Mayor's Inclusion Task Force, the Latino Forum, the Renton African American Pastoral Group, the the Vietnamese Chinese Forum. And also, the city has had experience in partnering with groups that have been formed by community members, such as the LGBTQIA plus community group, the Renton King County Alliance for Justice, faith groups, youth groups, etc. The value of input from these groups and the value of partnering with residents in these groups for city events and events in their respective communities has been tangible. It really has brought the city government home to community, and it has allowed the city to more readily hear the voice of community. And I would see the lead on this as executive services and equity housing and human services. When I first came on board in 2014, it was just me charged with supporting all of this. And you all wisely decided 2 years ago to move the equity functions to be part of a department, equity, housing, and human services, so that now your resources have expanded because we have a whole departmental team whose foundation focuses on equity, whether that's equity in human services, equity in affordable housing, equity in community outreach, and so forth. And so you have greater access to resources than you once had. So at this point, I would just like to open it up, ask you to what extent will these recommendations, once implemented, lead to your vision of equitable outcome in the city of Renton?
Council. Yeah, Benita always has homework for us. I'll start if no one else. I thank you for these Well, first, thank you for all you've done for us over the last 9 years. I remember how this all started from the race. Are we so different? And you coming and meeting with us, and us going to the Pacific Science Center, to this huge body of work that's been created over the last 9 years. So thank you for that. I think for me, implementing all of these things, to me, leads back to our business plan, where we said we want to have opportunities for all. I mean, when you look at this, it's really at the meat at what our business plan is. So I think it'd be fantastic. Councilmember Rivera.
Thank you, Council Pro Tem Prince. I do actually have a question, if that's all right. In regards to the Renton equity lens, I'm curious. It reminds me a lot of the 360 feedback model, and I'm wondering what differentiates it and what data has been collected to show that it actually produces equitable outcomes.
Tons of data. Most more and more city jurisdictions and quasi-governmental jurisdictions, nonprofit organizations, and so forth have adopted something like that. In 2004, City of Seattle created their what they called their racial equity toolkit. In 2009, King County created the EIR, Equity Impact Review Tool. And a lot of the equity lenses throughout the region have been based on those. But what the research shows is that there are a couple of factors, and you're right, there are some parallels to 360. There's some parallels to lean. There's really nothing new under the sun. It's kind of how we put it together. And what the equity lens is designed to do is to influence our decision making and shift it in a couple of significant ways. One is that at the early point of decision making, we identify who are the stakeholders, who are those most directly impacted by this policy, decision, program, whatever it is. And then two, to engage those stakeholders or a representative body of those stakeholders from the very beginning and throughout the process. The other thing, which parallels 360 and lean, is that the Renton equity lens, like other equity lens, is data driven. So it really, when I worked with human resources and risk management, for example, they spent over 6 months using the Renton equity lens to analyze their hiring processes. And they gathered a lot of data that really led them to look at what would have the greatest impact. Because initially, when they started, feedback they had from hiring managers was that HR, you just need to do a better job of outreach. You're not getting out there where we're, and getting the word out so that we're seeing diverse candidates apply for jobs. But when we looked at the data, and you can go to through NeoGov and pull out all this data, and they pulled out data from the whole previous year of applicants and disaggregated that data by race and gender. It pretty much lined up with the demographics of the city. So it wasn't a case where people weren't applying, but as we looked at that data as the applicants moved through the levels of the process. So for example, when the first step is to determine who's eligible for an interview, and then who's eligible for a second interview, who's hired. At each of those levels where hiring managers were involved, the applicant pool became incredibly less diverse. So, what that led us to was that the biggest factor here was implicit bias, because hiring managers, told us fervently they were committed to over time a workforce that really reflected the community of Renton. And so, what we did our research on was what would be practices that would help mitigate the impact of implicit bias in hiring. And we came up with 15 recommendations, which over time were either immediately adopted starting in 2018 or still being implemented over time. They have made a difference. And we can look at that data alone, but there's data from almost every organization. And as you know, Renton is a member of GARE, and they have also provided us with lots of data on the efficacy of using an equity lens.
Councilmember Rivera, thank you for the question. We'll add to that. We are in the process of creating an equity dashboard that will be able to provide metrics to council as well as to the public. Right now, we're just looking into what data sources we have, and then we'll be able to confirm with departments, did they use the equity lens, at what point in time, and then that way, because I don't know if we have it readily available or if it's been collected and quantified in that way to be presented, but the intent is to move forward. There's interest in transparency and us being able to help articulate for departments. So we are talking to several other agencies right now who have dashboards, as well as if you all have any recommendations or an agency or platform you'd like us to look into. But we're working with IT right now, as well as there's a larger initiative to move towards dashboards and, outward facing data. So I think it's a missing piece, and we will be providing that for future conversations. Thank you for asking.
Councilman Perez.
Thank you. Thank you, both of you. Thank you, MJ. Thank you, Benita, for everything and more. I love your presentation, and I love that you leave us with a lot of homework, because while I recognize how much we have done in the last 8 years, now that I see your recommendations, I feel like we're just scratching the surface of where we want to accomplish. There is a lot of work that we still have to do, and recognizing that the reason that the equity department was created. I love your recommendations. I know that some of them we can implement very easy, and some of them is going to take us a while before we get there. But personally, I have seen it in the last 8 years, how much we have changed and how much we have advanced. Just the formation of this body today, the way we look today, that the way we look, the council looked 8 years ago was completely different. And also in the past, I always felt that when we were looking for someone from a board or a commission, we were almost tokenizing minority members. Right now it's different. Right now it's like they are our communities, the community that we serve, and every voice has to be welcome in the table. And now we feel that we are part of the city of Renton, which for me, that at a personal note, as a woman of color, and as an immigrant and second language and all of those beautiful things, I don't feel that I have to keep repeating myself. I don't have to keep saying over and over, I'm sorry, I apologize, English is my second language. I feel like people now welcome me and accept me, and they understand me, and now there is not that, where are you from? I feel part and I feel I belong. So I hope that one day everybody in the city of Renton will feel the same way. And I always going to remember the great times that I have working with you, how much you have taught me, and how much I'm going to miss you every day. But I know that we're very lucky to have you here in Renton, and I know that we're going to keep working in the future because you're going to be in a wonderful organization that is going to be working with us as well. So thank you for everything, Benita. And again, I appreciate your recommendations.
One thing. I really appreciate recommendation number 6, the one on public sector contracting. It's one that when I'm out in the community outside of Renton, because of the work I do, I hear about the most is what are cities doing around public sector contracting. So I really do appreciate that. That's a recommendation that you have in here.
Councilmember Prince, actually, to speak to that as well, we'll be running through the revised policy. Finance has asked that go through the Equity Commission for review. So they're certainly open and interested for comment. So we appreciate that. So we'll be pushing that through that committee.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you.
And I think it's important to understand that, really to affirm that so much work has been done. It may not be visible, we may not be at the point where we see tangible outcomes, but there has been consistency through the 3 administrators that I've worked with in finance, starting with Ewan and then Jan and now Carrie. And there's been, they really haven't dropped a beat. That consistency has been there through all 3 leaders in that organization. So just need a little encouragement and the time and resources. And our city clerk has been part of that process as well. I just have to mention that. His contributions have been enormous.
I think the thing to know, as well as I was working on my notes for your council retreat, was that the city initiated this. It wasn't reactive, and it was 9 years ago. And I think the fact that we're all willing to be uncomfortable and challenged and questioned for the purpose of the greater good and to work beyond, I think sometimes, what you've grown up with, what what is your purview, I think has been could not have been done successfully without Benita pushing those conversations. And now you will be able to champion those beyond her participation, but she'll transition to being a resident, which we'll be grateful for, to have her in our community. But I think the fact that the city, again, initiated this and it was supported by staff and council and leadership says a lot about our community and our city. And I think we will only continue to grow and challenge ourselves to be better.
Anything else from the council members?
I'll say
Yes.
one thing. Benita, I don't have anything profound to ask or to say. I'll just keep it simple and say, job well done. Job well done. Absolutely.
All right. I think that might be the perfect note to end on.
Well, Council President Pro Tem and council members, I just, as always, I want to leave you with a last thought. Because, as my contract winds down, I'm getting a lot of affirmation about the work that I've done. And I just want to remind you that, a consultant is no better or worse than the team who hired them. Your consultant is a resource to you, much like your computer and all of the other tools that you have. And so if it were not for all of you, for the administrators, for the staff who throughout the different departments who've been pushing on this, we would not be, we're a city of what are we now? 106,000 and growing, and a city staff of is it 600 now? There's no way one person could make those kinds of changes. So I'm going to paraphrase a quote from Lao Tzu, a Chinese philosopher. A consultant is best when people barely know they exist. When their work is done, their aim fulfilled, the people will say, we did it ourselves. And that's what I see in Renton, that you all have done this yourselves. And I've just been so proud to be a resource to you on that journey. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Benita. And committee of the whole is adjourned. We'll convene at 7 p.m. As full council.